So how does a revolution, one that's born from this desperate cry for freedom, end up creating one of the most brutal dictatorships in history? It's an incredible and honestly a terrifying journey. Today, we're going to trace how Russia went from an ancient empire to a totalitarian state. Let's get right into it.
It all kicked off with a promise. Just three simple words: peace, bread, and land. But these words, they captured everything an entire nation, pushed right to the edge by war and hunger, was hoping for. This wasn't just some political slogan, it was a lifeline. And that's really the big question here, isn't it? We're going to follow that simple promise through all the chaos, the revolution, the civil war, the political terror, to see how a dream that was for the people got twisted into a tool for absolute total control.
Okay, so our story starts in 1917. The Romanov dynasty, they had been in power for over 300 years, but its foundations were about to just completely crumble, and with a speed that shocked everyone.
It all started in the capital, Petrograd. People were protesting the disastrous First World War and really severe food shortages. And then things just spiraled. When soldiers who were sent to crush the demonstrations actually joined them instead, well, that was it. It was over. The Tsar was forced to abdicate, and just like that, centuries of imperial rule, they were gone.
But what came next was just chaos. It created this really strange situation called dual power. So on one side, you had the official provisional government. But on the other, you had the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers that had the real power on the streets. Two governments, both claiming to be in charge? Yeah, that's a perfect recipe for total instability.
And this is where the story takes this fascinating, almost ironic turn. A threat from the right wing accidentally ended up empowering the far left. A general named Kornilov tried to seize power in a military coup, and guess who stood up to him? The Bolsheviks. And all of a sudden, they weren't just seen as a bunch of radicals anymore. They were being praised as the saviors of the revolution. And that new credibility, that was all the opportunity one man needed. And that man was Vladimir Lenin. He's back from exile, and he's got a plan to turn Russia and maybe the whole world completely upside down.
So riding this new wave of popularity, Lenin did not wait around. In October, the Bolsheviks seized key points all over the capital and stormed the Winter Palace. Now, unlike the huge mass uprising back in February, this was a swift, calculated, and actually pretty bloodless takeover. The Bolsheviks were now in charge.
So what's the very first thing Lenin does? He makes good on the first part of his promise, peace. He knew Russia couldn't possibly survive if it kept fighting in World War I. His number one priority was getting out, no matter what it cost.
And believe me, the cost was staggering. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was absolutely brutal. Russia lost enormous chunks of its most valuable territory. We're talking land, people, industry, resources, the whole shebang. So peace was achieved, yeah, but it came at the price of national humiliation and, frankly, economic disaster.
Grabbing power is one thing, but holding on to it, that's a whole different ballgame. The Bolsheviks were now surrounded by enemies, and the country was plunged into a vicious civil war.
To survive, they put in place this desperate policy called war communism. And this wasn't really about ideology, this was pure survival. The state seized control of, well, everything. That promise of bread and land, it was completely flipped on its head. Grain was forcibly taken from the peasants to feed the cities in the new Red Army.
But this brutal policy, it backfired spectacularly. Peasants rose up in revolt, like the massive Tambov Rebellion. And the crisis really hit its peak when even the Kronstadt sailors, who had been some of the most passionate supporters of the revolution, turned against the Bolsheviks. The whole regime was right on the verge of collapse.
Lenin, who was a pragmatist above everything else, he saw the writing on the wall. He slammed on the brakes, hard. The new economic policy, or the NEP, was a strategic retreat. It allowed for a limited amount of small-scale capitalism, basically giving the peasants back a little bit of their bread and land to get the economy moving again and stop the unrest. It was a compromise just to save the revolution.
And right in the middle of this fight for survival, one final, brutal act made sure there was no going back. The entire Romanov family was executed. This wasn't just about revenge. It was a cold, political calculation to get rid of any symbol that the anti-Bolshevik forces could possibly rally around.
When Lenin died in 1924, it left a huge power vacuum. And out of the struggle that followed, a new and much more ruthless leader would emerge, Joseph Stalin. And he was about to build a totally new kind of state.
Stalin's path to power was really paved with this powerful new idea.
While his rivals, like Trotsky, were still preaching about this permanent global revolution, Stalin argued for socialism in one country. His message was really simple. Let's forget about the world for now and focus on making our nation an invincible socialist superpower. For a country that was exhausted by war, that message really hit home.
And with that power consolidated, he launched the 5-year plans. The goal was absolutely monumental, to drag the Soviet Union from being this backward agrarian nation into an industrial powerhouse, and to do it in a single decade. The pace was relentless, the methods were brutal, and the focus shifted completely away from the peasants and towards industrial steel.
To fuel this insane drive, the state had to create new heroes. You had workers like the Stakhanovites, who supposedly smashed production records through just sheer effort. They were celebrated in propaganda everywhere. They became the model Soviet citizens, sacrificing absolutely everything for the industrial might of the nation.
And this is where those original promises of bread and land weren't just forgotten, they were violently annihilated. Stalin forced millions of peasants onto collective farms, stripping them of their land. The resistance and the chaos that followed led directly to a catastrophic famine that killed millions, especially in Ukraine. This was the horrific human price of Stalin's grand vision.
So, after transforming the economy, Stalin then turned on the people, and even on his own party, in this unimaginable wave of paranoia and violence. The revolution began to devour itself.
The trigger, or maybe it's better to say the pretext, was the murder of a popular party official, Sergei Kirov, back in 1934. Stalin used this single event to unleash the full force of the state security apparatus, the NKVD, against anyone and everyone he thought was a threat.
And the final steps to absolute power came chillingly fast. From Kirov's murder, the purges exploded into the Yezhovshchina, which was the absolute peak of the Great Terror, where hundreds of thousands were executed. By 1940, with the shocking Nazi-Soviet pact signed and his greatest rival Trotsky assassinated in Mexico, Stalin's control was total. The revolution was well and truly over.
So we come back to the main point. This journey that began with such a simple, powerful promise of peace, bread, and land for the people, it ended with a Red Tsar, ruling a superpower that was built on fear and force. And it leaves us with this profound and pretty unsettling question. How does a fight for freedom end in total control?